The Garden of Second Chances. Chapter 1. The Empty House. Margaret Bennett stood in the middle of her living room, surrounded by boxes. After 40 years of living in the same house, she was finally moving. Her children had moved out long ago, starting their own families, and her husband, Jack, had passed away 5 years ago. The house, once filled with laughter and life, now felt too big, too quiet, and too full of memories. As she packed away the last of the photo albums, she paused to look at a picture of her and Jack, taken on their 25th wedding anniversary. They were standing in front of a rose garden they had planted together, smiles on their faces and dirt on their hands. It had been their dream to one day retire to a small cottage with a big garden. But Jack's unexpected heart attack had shattered that dream. Now, at the age of 62, Margaret was starting over. She had sold the house and bought a small cottage in a quiet town a few hours away. It was a place she had never been to before, but something about it had drawn her in. Maybe it was the promise of a fresh start, or maybe it was just the need to leave the past behind. With one last look around the empty house, Margaret picked up her car keys and walked out the door. It was time to begin a new chapter. Chapter 2. The Overgrown Garden. The cottage was everything Margaret had hoped for. It was small and cozy, with a big backyard that was overgrown with weeds and wildflowers. As she stood on the back porch, she could see the potential for a beautiful garden. It would take a lot of work, but Margaret was ready for the challenge. The next morning, she woke up early and headed to the local gardening store. She needed tools, seeds, and advice. As she wandered through the aisles, she felt a sense of excitement she hadn't felt in years. She picked out a variety of flowers, vegetables, and herbs, determined to turn the overgrown yard into a paradise. When she got back to the cottage, she got to work. She started by clearing away the weeds, pulling them out by the roots. It was hard, physical labor, but it felt good to use her muscles and feel the sun on her skin. As she worked, she thought about Jack and the garden they had planted together. She missed him, but she also felt a sense of peace, knowing that he would have been proud of her for starting over. By the end of the day, Margaret was exhausted, but happy. She had cleared a small patch of land and planted her first row of flowers. As she stood back to admire her work, she felt a sense of accomplishment. This garden was going to be her second chance, her way of starting fresh and finding joy again. Chapter 3. The Neighbor. A few days later, while Margaret was out in the garden, she heard a voice behind her. "That's quite a project you've taken on," the voice said. Margaret turned around to see an elderly man standing at the edge of her yard. He was tall and lean, with a weathered face and kind eyes. He was holding a trowel in one hand and a potted plant in the other. "I'm Henry," he said with a smile. "I live next door. I couldn't help but notice you've been working on this garden. It's looking good." "Thank you," Margaret replied, wiping the sweat from her brow. "I'm Margaret. I just moved here. I thought a garden would be a good way to get settled." Henry nodded. "Gardening is a great way to start over. It's been my therapy for years. If you need any help or advice, just let me know. I've got a green thumb and plenty of time on my hands." Margaret smiled. "I might take you up on that. I've got a lot to learn." Over the next few weeks, Henry became a regular visitor to Margaret's garden. He would stop by with tips and tools, and they would work side by side, pulling weeds and planting seeds. As they worked, they talked about their lives. their losses, and their dreams. Margaret learned that Henry had also lost his wife, and that gardening had helped him cope with his grief. He understood her in a way that few people did. Chapter 4. The Garden Grows. As the weeks turned into months, Margaret's garden began to flourish. The flowers she had planted burst into bloom, filling the air with their sweet fragrance. The vegetables grew tall and strong, and Margaret found joy in harvesting them and using them in her cooking. The garden became her sanctuary, a place where she could escape from the world and find peace. But it wasn't just the garden that was growing. Margaret herself was changing. She felt a sense of purpose and fulfillment that she hadn't felt in years. She was making new friends in the town, joining a gardening club, and even volunteering at the local community center. She was starting to feel like herself again. Henry continued to be a constant presence in her life. They spent hours together in the garden, talking and laughing, and their mornings in the garden tending to the plants. They found joy in each other's company and in the simple act of creating something beautiful together. As they were sitting on the porch, watching the sunset, Henry turned to Margaret and said, "I've really enjoyed spending time with you, Margaret. You've brought a lot of joy into my life." Margaret smiled. "I feel the same way, Henry. You've been a great friend." Henry reached out and took her hand. "I was wondering if you'd like to be more than friends." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't been looking for romance, but she couldn't deny the connection she felt with Henry. She squeezed his hand and said, "I'd like that." Chapter 5. The Storm. Just as Margaret and Henry were starting to explore their new relationship, a fierce storm swept through the town. The winds were strong, and the rain came down in sheets. Margaret and Henry did their best to protect the garden, covering the plants with tarps and tying down anything that could be blown away. But the storm was relentless. When it finally passed, Margaret's garden was a mess. Many of the plants had been uprooted, and the flowers were battered and bruised. Margaret stood in the middle of the destruction, tears in her eyes. It felt like all her hard work had been for nothing. Henry put his arm around her. "It's going to be okay, Margaret. Gardens are resilient. We'll replant and start again." Margaret nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling of loss. It reminded her of all the other times in her life when things had fallen apart, when Jack had died, when her children had moved away, when she had felt so alone. But then she looked at Henry and saw the determination in his eyes. She realized that she wasn't alone anymore. She had him, and together they could rebuild the garden, just as they were rebuilding their lives. Chapter 6. The New Beginning. Over the next few weeks, Margaret and Henry worked tirelessly to restore the garden. They replanted the flowers, tended to the vegetables, and added new features like a bird bath and a bench. Slowly but surely, the garden began to come back to life. As they worked, Margaret and Henry grew closer. They spent their evenings on the porch, talking and laughing, and their mornings in the garden tending to the plants. They found joy in each other's company and in the simple act of creating something beautiful together. One day, as they were planting a new row of roses, Margaret turned to Henry and said, "Do you remember the story I told you about the garden Jack and I planted?" Henry nodded. "Of course. It sounded like a beautiful place." Margaret smiled. "It was. But you know what? This garden is even more beautiful because it's ours." Henry took her hand and kissed it. "Yes, it is. and it's just the beginning." As they stood there surrounded by the fruits of their labor, Margaret felt a sense of peace and contentment she hadn't felt in years. She had started over in a new place, with a new garden and a new love. It wasn't the life she had planned, but it was a life she was grateful for. And as the sun set over the garden of second chances, Margaret knew that she had found her happily ever after. The end.